Well, these books, I think, are essentially asking us to think about deterrence as it might be applied in the future and how it might be applied today. It's interesting because the first chapter talks about how ancient an idea deterrence is. Not something newly invented, but something that goes back eons in effect. And sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't, but it was always a part of foreign policy, always a part of national security policy. The difference, I think, in the historical look at deterrence and how it evolved during the Cold War was that mainly because of the advent of the nuclear weapon, a weapon that essentially was too powerful to use under ordinary circumstances, deterrence became a much, much larger feature of international security policy. It became a much larger feature in our own defense policy. It basically overwhelmed almost everything else you could think about, so that when people talked about deterrence, they didn't think about deterrence with conventional forces. They automatically thought about deterrence with nuclear weapons. Without casting aspersions on my friends in the Hoover Press, who did a wonderful job in creating this book, the first picture they presented to me as to what should be on the cover of this book was the image of the atom. And I said to them, well, we're not talking really about nuclear deterrence here, we're talking about deterrence in general. So we came up with a different picture. But all this shows you that automatically everyone, including I suspect most of you, if you talk deterrence, sooner or later you begin to talk about, we're talking about the nuclear deterrent. Well, so much has changed since the Cold War ended that we need to get out of that framework, and it's been very difficult for us to do that. It's been very difficult for administrations, including this one, which probably wanted to get beyond that idea, to really think about security problems in different ways. If you think about nuclear deterrence today, and George Shultz mentioned this, well, probably it should be effective in preventing other countries from using nuclear weapons against us. You could certainly expect that as a minimum. But people don't really think of it just in those terms. I think it should do a lot more. And they're disappointed, I think, when they feel it doesn't. We are faced with problems in Iran, and we're faced with problems in North Korea, and we have overwhelming nuclear forces, and yet we could not deter them from moving step by step towards acquiring the capability, in the case of Iran, and the actual nuclear weapons in the case of North Korea. We didn't have a nuclear potential that was capable of doing that despite the kinds of forces that we have. What does that tell you? Well, it tells you we could almost certainly prevent North Korea from invading South Korea or from using nuclear weapons. So nuclear, any kind of deterrence, even conventional in our case, would be enough for that. But when you try to extend nuclear weapons beyond their realistic reach now, today, I think you're demanding too much. What takes its place? What takes the place of nuclear deterrence? I think essentially, if you think about it, what you're trying to do is influence other countries. You're trying to influence them not to do something, you're trying to influence them to do something you want them to do. And there are a lot of different ways of doing that. In other words, you have to bundle together a lot of different kinds of approaches, of which military force is one. You never take military force off the table. And if I tell you that deterrence doesn't have the same meaning today that it had during the Cold War, I'm certainly not telling you that military force does not have the same meaning, because it does. But there are other means of influencing countries, influencing through, for example, financial operations. I think we can think about a deterrent based on that, actually. You can think about deterrence through having strong alliances that overwhelm another country that might be thinking about doing something. So there are a lot of different types of deterrence. The kinds of threats we're facing today are so different that you have to ask yourself, is deterrence relevant at all in some of those cases? For example, terrorism. Yeah, I think you could probably deter a country from harboring terrorists? Probably you could do that. But can you deter the terrorists themselves from going about their business of trying to acquire nuclear weapons? That's very hard, and I would even argue that you really can't do it. You have to have the ability to deny the terrorists access to the kinds of weapons that could hurt us, namely nuclear weapons mainly. So you have also the problem, I think, that during the Cold War there was a big consensus. There were two superpowers. The world was kind of organized around that antagonism. And when we proposed something, people tended to fall in line. Now you have the diffusion of power. I won't go into whether we have lost absolute power ourselves, but there certainly has been a diffusion of power. Many other countries have influence in different parts of the world. And to get a consensus on what you do about North Korea, or what you do about Iran, which is the bedrock for having a strong deterrent, it's very hard to do. You've seen that you can't get China on board on doing some things, or Russia on board. It's not because they necessarily disagree with us about the desirability of where we should be in the end, but they have different views and they don't necessarily fall in line. So deterrence today, I think, has to be seen in a much, much different way than it did in the past. I think the previous speakers have talked about the implication of that for where we might want to go in maintaining nuclear weapons. I think it suggests to me anyway that the possibilities of reducing nuclear weapons far below where they are now are quite significant. We could probably do that without any loss whatsoever in deterrence. But the important thing that I want to leave with you is that I think all of us need to really think about when our leaders talk about deterrence, are they using that as a kind of default position? Is it kind of an automatic knee-jerk reaction to say, well, we're going to deter this or that? Because you do hear that quite a lot, even from very top people who probably should know better. And I think we all have to think about how we want to have our weight felt in the world in realistic ways, in ways that react to current situations and not so much based on past experience. I'll leave you with that.
Thank you. David, he's a real Russian expert in our group.
There was a phrase that became popular in the Cold War, and I think it came from Herman Kahn, called thinking the unthinkable, to describe the exercise of trying to think through what nuclear war would be like and ways to prevent nuclear war. I like to think of the vision of a world free of nuclear weapons as thinking the second nuclear unthinkable, namely how to get rid of these weapons. And I think over the years, we've given far more attention to the first question, or the first version, than to the second. And I must say, I'm extremely happy to have been associated with the initiative that George and Bill started to think through what a world free of nuclear weapons would be like and how to get there. During the Cold War, we had, of course, enormous stockpiles of nuclear weapons built up by the United States and the Soviet Union. And we also had the elaboration of complex doctrines centered around ideas of deterrence to try to manage the strategic relationship and the strategic competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. And that regime, that kind of conceptual and institutional apparatus built around deterrence, both understandings of what the consequences of nuclear war would be, the creation of back channels to try to defuse crises, arms control negotiations. This complex regime to try to handle the strategic nuclear competition was, I think, quite elaborate, in many ways quite ingenious, but one can, I think in the end, it was not foolproof. And Bill Perry mentioned one case of a false alarm in which he was directly involved. There's a very famous incident on the Soviet side in September 1983, where the control center in Moscow picked up on the radars that there was an ICBM coming towards the Soviet Union from the United States, and then some seconds later that there were 5 ICBMs on their way. And the duty officer didn't report this up the line. He just took the decision that this was a false alarm. And when asked afterwards, why he had been so sure, he said, well, when I was at the military academy, I learned that the United States, if it's going to attack us, isn't going to attack us with one ICBM or 5. It'll be hundreds of ICBMs coming after us. It doesn't make sense for them to attack us with one. He later lost his position. He was dismissed. And you can say either here was the man who saved the world from catastrophe, or here was a soldier who didn't obey his instructions, which was actually to report such an alarm up the line. The conceptual apparatus that we worked out in the Cold War, ideas about strategic stability and so on, remain very powerful, even though the Cold War is long over. A nuclear war between the US and Russia now is, I think, inconceivable, yet both countries maintain large strategic nuclear forces on a high level of alert. And the meeting in Brussels that Bill Perry and I were at last week with Russians about the possibility of cooperation in ballistic missile defense, I think illustrated just how deep the mistrust, as it were, between the two countries is. Because, as the Russians made very clear, they said our relationship is still based on mutual deterrence. And it isn't so much the fact that either side fears an attack right now, but maybe in the future things will develop in a way that will bring us back to hostility and enmity. And one of the interesting issues, I think, in the is the kind of conceptual hold that deterrence and mutual deterrence and ideas of the stability of deterrence still have on the dialogue, probably more strongly in the Russian case, actually, on the dialogue about nuclear disarmament and the overall relationship. So many people, as Jim Goodby said, are trying to break out of this kind of way of thinking about nuclear weapons. And of course, if you have guns pointed at your head, it's not so easy to do. It's hard work to build trust and move away from the idea that even if not now, maybe in some future, a nuclear war would again seem to be a possibility. So the task that I was asked or given in this last conference was to think about deterrence and enforcement in a world free of nuclear weapons. Well, the first thing to say is, of course, we would be in a post-nuclear, not a pre-nuclear world. Secondly, Jonathan Schell in the early 1980s came up with the idea of virtual deterrence, that you could get rid of all the nuclear weapons, but the possibility of reconstitution would constitute in itself a form of deterrence. If one thinks in that way, then you have to think through, I think, quite complicated issues to do with how such a relationship could be stable and not give an advantage to somebody who managed to break out of the non-nuclear world in a surreptitious or clandestine way. So one way in which a nuclear deterrence might remain in a post-nuclear world would be this kind of residual fear until you had moved right away from that point. And the second way comes back to George's example of taxes. Imagine, so the first form of virtual nuclear deterrence might be that if a major power thought, oh, let's rebuild our nuclear forces quickly and clandestinely, the deterrent would be that it couldn't do so before some other power or some other center reconstituted its forces, and you'd just be back in deterrent relationship with nuclear weapons, and the breakout state would be no better off. But there's also, of course, another possibility, which is that in a world free of nuclear weapons, the major powers, indeed the international community, would be extremely concerned at the possibility of breakout by any state. And so it raises the question whether the use of force against states seeking to break out from a non-nuclear world would then become a legitimate and legal use of force, just as the way imprisoning people who don't pay their taxes somewhere and shown in court not to pay their taxes would be. And that would be a transformation.
That example really got to you, didn't it?
Yes, it did. I'm going to be more careful with my tax forms next year. But the final point I wanted to make was that I think if even in a post-nuclear world we're thinking about deterrence, I think we do have to think about stability much more broadly. We won't, and I think this comes back to the issue of trust, we won't get to a world free of nuclear weapons until I think the major powers, however you define that group, decide that such a world is safer and more secure for everyone involved, and then are willing to set up the institutions that would make it possible to detect attempted breakout and to enforce the kind of regime. And that, of course, is, it sounds simple to say it, but of course would be an enormously challenging proposition.
Thank you, David. Well, we've all talked here about this subject. As you can see, we're struggling. The fact is that since we had our first conference here at Hoover 5 years ago and published our op-ed, there has been an astonishing worldwide response, and a lot of headway has been made. And examining the subject of deterrence is part of it. However, there's a really hard road ahead with North Korea, with Iran as two examples. But we keep working at it, and the Deterrence Conference was part of it.